Chapter 13 of The Christmas Reindeer. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Karen Hunt. The Christmas Reindeer by Thornton W. Burgess. The Willful Young Deer. Of all the young deer in the great herd, and there were many, Little Spot was the most willful. He was called Little Spot because he was marked exactly like his mother, who was known as Big Spot. Each had a white spot between the eyes. Now, Big Spot was one of the wisest leaders among all the reindeer people. She was wise in the ways of the wolf and the bear, and she was wise in the ways of men. Under her leadership, the herd thrived and increased and was seldom troubled. But with all her wisdom, Big Spot was a poor mother. You see, she was just like a great many other mothers. She spoiled her children. So Little Spot, who was so like his mother, had never been taught to mind. Almost from the day of his birth, which had been in the spring before the snow had melted, he had been headstrong and willful. He had been a handsome baby, as reindeer babies go, and his mother had been very proud of him. Perhaps that is why she spoiled him. Anyway, he went where he pleased and did what he pleased, and was forever in trouble of some sort. When he got his first horns, 2 sharp spikes, he made such a nuisance of himself that he soon became known as the worst young deer in the whole herd. Other young deer would have nothing to do with him because he was so overbearing. He was a little bigger and a little stronger than any others of his own age, and this, together with the fact that he had been allowed to have his own way, had quite spoiled him. "My son," said his mother, when she found him with a small band of caribou, which he had run away to join, "follow me to the top of yonder hill. I want to talk to you." "I don't want to be talked to," said Little Spot, with an angry toss of his head. "I know what you want. You want me to go back with the herd. I'm not going. I'm going to stay with my wild cousins, the caribou. I don't want to go back to the herd. I won't go back to the herd." He stamped his feet in the naughtiest way. "Very well," said his mother. "You may stay with your cousins, the caribou. But remember that if you need me, you will find me on the top of that hill over there." Little Spot tossed his head. He sniffed. You see, he didn't like it at all that his mother should think that he had any need of her. Had he not horns already? He felt quite equal to taking care of himself. So he tossed his head and sniffed, then went over to join some of the young caribou about his own age. His mother said nothing more, but slowly walked away in the direction of the hill. When she reached the top, she stood motionless for a long time. Looking up, Little Spot could see her against the sky, and he, being a foolish young deer, became very angry. He felt that she was keeping watch over him, so he pretended not to see her, and when presently the small band of caribou started to move away briskly, he trotted along with them. They were glad to have him. At least they made no objections. The farther he got from that hill where his mother still stood, the bigger and more important he felt. He was out in the great world now. He was master of his own movements. There was no one to make him do this or do that. He held his head high and he stepped high. You see, he was trying to look as important as he felt. Without warning, 4 great gray wolves swept out from behind some willow trees to cut off the young caribou from the remainder of the band. Such terror as there was then! Each young caribou started in a different direction. It was well for Little Spot that he was swifter of foot than any of the others. At the first glimpse of the dreaded wolves, he had whirled about and started back for that hill where his mother was. They were the first wolves he had ever seen, but he knew what they were. Not once did he look behind to see what was happening to the young caribou. Forgotten was all his pride. He wanted his mother, and he wanted her as he had never wanted her before. Was she not the wisest of all the mothers of the big herd? She would know what to do. She would know how to care for him. He looked over to the top of that little hill. For a moment it seemed as if his heart stopped beating. He could not see Big Spot anywhere. Had she left him after all? Had she started off on that long, swift trot of hers to get back to the herd? The mere thought that he might never see her again gave added speed to Little Spot. Never had he run as he was running now, But it was not good running, it was unwise running, for it was taking his wind and his strength. He was panting hard when he came over the top of the hill. There, in a little hollow just beyond, stood his mother. "What is it, my son?" said she, as little Spot crowded against her, panting as if he could never get his breath again. "What is it, my son? I thought you wanted to go out into the great world." "Wolves!" panted little Spot. "Wolves! We must run!" His mother merely walked up to the brow of the hill and looked back. "Truly, my son, they are wolves," said she, and returned to him as if wolves were the most commonplace things in the world. End of chapter 13.
Chapter 14 of the Christmas Reindeer. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Christmas Reindeer by Thornton W. Burgess. When the World Was Young. Little Spot, the willful young reindeer, trembled as he crowded up to his mother. He couldn't get close enough to her. He no longer wanted to be out in the great world by himself. He wondered that his mother did not run. Every moment or two he looked back to see if those wolves were coming up over the hill. But Big Spot seemed in no hurry at all. You see, she was wise, with the wisdom of experience. She didn't want little Spot to get over his fright so soon that he would forget the lesson he had learned. Then, too, she wanted him to get rested a little and get his wind back. At last she quieted little Spot's fears. "Those wolves did not chase you, my son," she said. "They chased the young caribou, and it is very fortunate for you that they did." "I'm sure I could run faster than those wolves," said little Spot boastfully. "Yes, you could," replied his mother. "You could run faster than they could for a while. But you do not know the patience of wolves, my dear. You would have run so hard and so fast that presently you would have tired yourself out so that the wolves would have had no trouble in catching you. Ever since you were a little fawn, I have told you about the wolves, and that they are our worst enemies. But I don't think you ever have believed it. Now you have seen them and you know what they are like. The wolves are very smart people. They watch for a deer to stray away. Then they get between the herd and that deer. When this happens, that deer will not live long." "Have the deer always been afraid of the wolves?" asked little Spot. "Ever since the days when the world was young," replied his mother. "Tell me about the days when the world was young," begged little Spot. For a few moments his mother said nothing. Gradually into her big dark eyes there crept a faraway look. "Once upon a time," she began at last, "the world was mostly water, like the salt water that you saw in the summer." "But where did the deer live then?" interrupted little Spot. "There were no deer then," said his mother. "There were no deer, and there were no wolves, and there were none of those two-legged creatures called men. You see, Old Mother Nature had not made them yet, for there was no land for them to live on. But by and by there was land, and then for a very long time Old Mother Nature was very, very busy making the different kinds of people to live on the land. Some of these people she made to live where it was summer, all the year round. You should have seen little Spot's big ears prick up at that. "Is there such a place?" he cried. His mother nodded. "Yes," said she. I am told there is a land where it is summer all the time. How do you think you would like that?" Little Spot thought it over for a moment. "I shouldn't like it," he decided. "Why, if it is summer all the time, there can be no snow. What a queer land it must be without the beautiful snow. I shouldn't like it." His mother again nodded her head approvingly. "Neither should I, my son," said she. "But it seems that in those days when the world was young, all the people, big and little, wanted to live where it was summer. So after a while it became difficult for all the people to get food enough. It was then that the hard times began, and some of the big people began to hunt the little people for food. Now it happened that Mr. and Mrs. Caribou, the first of all the caribou, had wandered beyond the land where it was summer all the time. They had come to the land where it was summer for half the year and winter for the other half. When the winter came, they moved back, because, you see, they were not fitted to make their living when snow covered the ground, and they were not clothed warmly enough to stand the bitter winds. But they always stayed as long as they could before moving south, for they loved the Northland. Then, too, they felt safer there, for there were fewer to hunt them. It was on the edge of the Northland that Old Mother Nature found Mr. and Mrs. Caribou looking longingly at the land they must leave because of the coming of the snow and ice. "How would you like to live in the Northland all of the time?" asked Old Mother Nature. Mr. Caribou looked at Mrs. Caribou, and Mrs. Caribou looked at Mr. Caribou, and then both looked at Old Mother Nature. Mr. Caribou spoke rather hesitatingly. "We could not eat when all the ground is covered with snow," said he. "There is always plenty of food beneath the snow," replied Old Mother Nature. "You could dig away the snow with your feet and find plenty." "But we should freeze," protested Mrs. Caribou, and shivered. For in those days the coats of the caribou were thin. "But supposing I gave you warm coats and fitted you to live in the Northland, would you do it?" Old Mother Nature asked. Again Mr. Caribou looked at Mrs. Caribou, and Mrs. Caribou looked at Mr. Caribou. Then both nodded. So Mother Nature gave them warm coats. She gave them each a thick mantle of long hair on the neck, so that it hung down and the wind could not get through it. She fashioned their feet so that they were different from the feet of any other of the deer family, and they could walk in snow and on soft ground where others could not go. Then she sent them into the Northland, and there the caribou have been ever since. "But what about the reindeer?" cried Little Spot. "I am coming to that," replied his mother. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of The Christmas Reindeer. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Tom Merritt. The Christmas Reindeer by Thornton W. Burgess. The First Reindeer. Mr. and Mrs. Caribou were the first of all the caribou to make their home in the far north, and they loved it. Old Mother Nature had told them truly that they would find plenty of food. So they and their children and their children's children took possession of all the great land where the snow lay most of the year. "They found the moss which you like so well, my son," said his mother. They found the moss, and they found that it was best in winter. It isn't true moss, you know, but is called reindeer moss by everybody. In the summer they lived on grass and other plants, just as we do. So in time there became very many caribou, and they lived in peace, for it was long before others came to live in the land of snow. But there came a time when these two-legged creatures called men appeared. They were hunters, and they hunted the caribou. They needed the meat for food and the skins for clothing and to make their tents. So the caribou became necessary to man. Then one day the hunters surrounded a band of caribou and captured alive all the fawns and young caribou. These they kept watch over and protected from the wolves and the bears, which had by this time come to live in the Northland. And because there were no wise old deer to protect these young deer, the young deer did not try to run away. They were content to graze near the homes of the hunters. In time, they grew and had fawns of their own, and these grew, and the herd increased. And these, my son, were the first reindeer. They were necessary to man if he would live in the far north, and they found that man was necessary to them. They furnished man with food and clothing. From their antlers he made tools. Man furnished them protection and found the best feeding grounds for them, so that they lived better and more contentedly than their cousins, the wild caribou. For the latter had always, by day and night, to be on the watch for enemies. Then one day a boy fastened a halter to a pet deer, and fastened him so that he could not stray away. In time that deer became used to the halter and to being fastened. Then the boy built a sled. It wasn't such a nice sled as the sleds of today, because you know this was the first sled of its kind. Then he fastened the deer to the sled, and with a long line fastened to the halter on each side of the deer's head, so that he might guide him, the boy climbed on the sled. Of course that deer was frightened, and he ran. By and by the sled upset, but the boy still held the reins. That was the first reindeer to be driven by man. The boy's father had seen all that happen. He built a better sled, and he and the boy trained that deer and other deer. Then, with these deer, they made long journeys. So it was that the reindeer became of still more use to man. "But I don't want to be harnessed and driven and have to drag a sled," said little Spot. "That shows your lack of wisdom, my son," replied his mother. "The deer who best draw the sleds are the deer that are cared for best and will live longest. Other deer are killed for food and for their skin, but not the deer who draw the sleds. Those are the deer that are thought most of, and it is my hope that you will be one day the finest sled deer in all the herd. Who knows? Perhaps you may be chosen in the Valley of the Good Spirit to be one of the 8 deer who once in the early winter of each year carry the Good Spirit on a wonderful journey out into the great world, that he may spread love and happiness. Do you remember, my son, how on the day we left the Valley of the Good Spirit, all we mother deer and all you youngsters stood while the finest bucks in all the herd milled around us? and how every once in a while they stopped. Little Spot bobbed his head. "I remember," said he. "Each time they stopped," replied his mother, "the good spirit chose one of their number to be added to his team for that wonderful journey out into the great world. They become magic deer just for a little while, at a time that menfolk call Christmas. They become magic deer, and all the children of the great world love them, though they never have seen them. So, my son, be wise in the wisdom of the deer folk. Be not unruly, should it be that you are chosen to draw the sled of a man, for it is only the best sled deer that are chosen by the good spirit and become the Christmas deer for that magic journey into the great world. Now, we must be getting back to the herd, or those wolves may get upon our trail." Little Spot trotted beside his mother, Big Spot, over the snow-covered prairie. And as he trotted, he thought deeply of all his mother had told him. And as he thought, his eyes were opened, so that by the time they reached the big herd, Little Spot was no longer a willful young deer. He no longer thought that he knew all there was to know, but he did his very best to try to learn all there was for a wise deer to know. And you know, when one tries to learn, it is surprisingly easy. So, from being the most willful and unruly of all the young deer, Little Spot became the most obedient and the best mannered. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of The Christmas Reindeer. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Tom Merritt. The Christmas Reindeer by Thornton W. Burgess. Little Spot and Tuck-Two dream. Do you ever have daydreams? If you do, you know that they are made up partly of wishes, partly of plans, and partly of the same sort of stuff that sleep dreams are made of. Tuck-Two was very busy these winter days. She was very busy indeed, as were all the Eskimo girls and their mothers. What do you think she was doing? You never would guess. She was chewing. Yes, sir, she was chewing. And it wasn't gum that she was chewing either, although she dearly loved to chew gum when she got the chance. She was chewing skins. What's that? You think I am fooling? I'm not. Tuck-Two was chewing skins. Tuck-Two was making boots for her brother and her father. They were made of skin, and Tuck-Two was chewing this in order to soften it and make it workable. But as she chewed, and later as she sewed, making the skin clothing for herself and for her brother and father, she did a great deal of dreaming. Perhaps you can guess what she dreamed of. It was Santa Claus. She didn't call him Santa Claus even to herself. She still called him the Good Spirit. I think myself that is rather a beautiful name for Santa Claus. And it wasn't things that she wanted Santa Claus to bring her that Tuck-Two dreamed. It was of helping Santa Claus. It seemed to her that nothing in all the great world would be so good or make her so happy as to help the Good Spirit spread the message of love and good cheer and happiness to all the little children less fortunate than she. Now, this is going to surprise you. Tuktu actually thought that she lived in the finest part of all the great world, and she was sorry for little boys and girls who lived where there were no reindeer and where snow and ice were seldom found. She was sorry for boys and girls who had never ridden behind a fast-trotting deer. Yes, Tuktu thought that she lived in the very best part of all the great world, and she loved it, and she wished somehow that she could help Santa, the good spirit, when he carried happiness and joy to all the great world. Sometimes when she dreamed, she would forget to chew the skin that she was at work on, and her mother would gently remind her that the boots were needed. She wondered if she could make a pair of boots for the good spirit, and then her face grew warm with shame at her boldness. How could anyone even think of doing anything for the good spirit? For could not the good spirit have all things he desired? And then she remembered something. She remembered that the good spirit had said that those chosen deer ought to be good sled deer because of the time he spent training them. Supposing she and Aklok could get the deer trained so well beforehand that the good spirit would not have to spend time in training them. Perhaps then he could start earlier. Then she sighed, for how could she be sure the good spirit would choose the deer she and Aklok trained? And while Tuktu dreamed her daydreams as she worked, little Spot, the finest young deer in all the herd, was dreaming daydreams. And the queer part of it is, his dreams were very like the dreams of Tuktu. He dreamed of being a magic deer. He dreamed of being one of that team of magic deer with which the good spirit made his wonderful journey out into the great world each Christmas. And because he remembered what his mother had said, he tried very hard to be what a young deer should be, for he hoped that in time he would be chosen for a sled deer. Perchance if he were chosen for a sled deer and became the best sled deer in all the great herd, he might someday be chosen in the valley of the good spirit. So he did his best to grow strong and handsome, and to be the swiftest footed, for he had discovered that it was the strongest, handsomest, and swiftest deer that were chosen to draw the sleds of the herders. But there was one big difference in the dreaming of these two young dreamers. Tuktu had no thought of self, whereas little Spot was thinking chiefly of his own glory. He had no thought of others, but only great ambition for himself. There are many people like little Spot in the great world. Now, I don't want you to think that Tuktu spent all her time chewing and sewing skins. That was work which could be done when the great storms and the bitter cold kept her indoors. She had her playtime as well as her working time, and there were many happy hours spent with Aklok, helping him herd the deer, for she dearly loved the deer people, and they loved her. Even the wildest of them and the most unruly would allow Tuktu to approach and even to pet them. Aklok was growing to be a very fine herder. His father, Kutok, said that Aklok would one day be the best herder in all the Northland. But not even Aklok understood the deer, as did Tuktu. End of chapter 16.
Please subscribe to update new videos. Please share and like if you enjoyed the video. Thanks so much.